This is now our second part on multimedia, and in this week once again we will concentrate on images. We have further options. For example, what we can create is one single image that contains a lot of icons, so-called sprites. And nevertheless, in this one single image we can still make only one single icon be displayed on our website. And this is what we will be starting with in this week. And then we go over into different formats that images can have to ultimately for us to decide which format is the best in what situation. And then we go over into gradients, which are merging images, merging color images. So ultimately all we need to do, we need to give to the browser a couple of colors, and it's the browser then ultimately that creates us that image. And then finally we go into border images, which are images that are inside the border area of an element. And last week what we have discussed were colors. So that was rather a minor part of last week. Towards the end we have seen that we cannot access every color by using an English keyword, because not every color has an English keyword assigned to it. So therefore, whenever we want to use a quite larger range of colors, we need to go for a color code. So we introduced the RGB code and the hex code. And both of them are based on red, green and blue, the three base colors by which we can mix any other color. And the options that we have in both of these codes, we can ultimately decide how much red we want. 256 options we have there, and the same amount of options we have for green and also for blue ultimately. And 256 options are the options that we have when we are communicating 1 byte, which are 8 bits, 8 times 1 or 0. And ultimately we can reorganize these 8 ones and zeros into 256 combinations. Therefore, that gives us 256 options to what we want to communicate, such as, for example, 256 different amounts, different shades of red or green or blue ultimately. The major part, however, of last week was the content images and the background images. Content images and background images, it's often pretty clear when to use which option, such as, for example, for our entire background image for our website. It's a background image, of course. Then whenever something is part of our content, then we should use a content image. But sometimes we really face a situation in which both of these options make sense. And to ultimately, for us to decide which option to then choose, we will face those two options off with further detail. But before we do so, we first need to go into sprites, because that one also goes into that evaluation process ultimately of what to use, which option, content images or background images. And therefore let us divide now images up into two different categories irrespective of HTML and CSS. So one category are photos and the other one is icons. Icons are the ones that we have on top here, of course. And photos are photos. And photos have this great advantage because they most of the time they are done in JPEG. And JPEG has this great advantage that we can reduce the file size of an image quite tremendously by kicking out pixels. And that is that core feature of JPEG. For example, this image right here that I'm having has a file size of 15.8 megabytes. And it's comprised of a lot of pixels. Each pixel has 256 different options of red, green and blue, ultimately deciding at that given point, at that given pixel, what color shall be there. That means that each pixel ultimately has 3 bytes. So 24 bits ultimately, one pixel is comprised. And therefore that the total of all the pixels together ultimately make up the file size. How much it is. So this one, for example, is 15.8 megabytes. And that is far too large to be used on the web. On the web, we only can make use of images that have, for as a rule of thumb, a size of clearly below actually 1 megabyte. That is just a rule of thumb. Sometimes situations come across that change that rule. But as a rule of thumb, we should always be clearly below 1 megabyte. So, for example, this background image, if that one had a size of 15 megabyte, then it would show up very slowly once the page is loaded. It wouldn't be displayed in its full straight away. And this is of course something that we never want to happen. It shall always be there. Once the page is loaded, the image shall also be there. It shall not show up very slowly. And that is now that core feature of JPEG. We can now kick out pixels and therefore tremendously reduce the file size of our image ultimately. So I will now be reducing the file size of that image, which is 15.8 megabytes. And herefore we can do it manually by, such as for example using this website. And there are alternatives out there as well. And later we will be doing that dynamically once we go into PHP. But for now, let us do it manually. And I'm now changing the width of that image from 5000 to 2000. And here is that core feature from JPEG. We can kick out pixels. And what I'm telling him now here is kick out 1/3 of the pixels. And it doesn't do it randomly. It does it only at locations where the human eye is less likely to detect any differences, that there are pixels gone at that position of the image. So I have done this already because it takes a while until this compression is done. So this is the ultimate end result from 5000 to 2000 pixels in width and kicking 1/3 of the pixels out, ultimately resulting in that quality of the image, which to my eye at least would be fine to be used on the web. And the file size that we have now saved is 96.9%. So we went from 15.8 megabytes down to 0.5 megabytes. And that file size is absolutely fine to be used on the web ultimately. It's clearly below 1 megabyte. So that is that core feature that JPEG has, and photos are usually on the web, they are JPEG images. Now once we take them with a camera, usually they are already JPEG. There are other options as well, or RAW is another option, a common option, but JPEG is usually the one. So that one we should should make use of once we use our images on the web, because then we can tremendously reduce that file size, which is necessary for the web, for images to be used on the web. Now in comparison to icons, this compression of kicking out pixels is not really needed. First of all, icons are much smaller. These are small images, and also they are also made up of only a couple of colors. So nevertheless, they still get compressed ultimately, but they will be recombined in their original form once again. For example, the compression that is done for icons is that for the white, for example, this image has a width of 32 pixels, meaning there are 32 pixels white in a row, then next row again 32 pixels white, and again, until then there are 32 pixels blue. So instead of communicating ultimately the 3 bytes for white, and then again 3 bytes for white, and again, so what the compression does ultimately is just saying, hey, that's 32 times white, 32 times 3 bytes, which is much easier to say than white 32 times. So this is the compression done for these icons, because these are a common file format that is used for these icons is PNG. And PNG doesn't need to lose any pixels, and it cannot lose any pixels. So that is the compression done with PNG, and the core feature that these icons, however, need is opacity. It's not referring to those icons that are of square format, like the Great Britain flag here or the Russian flag, but for the magnifier, that one is not a square. It's made up of a circle and one of those handlebars that it has. And that one, if that one didn't have opacity around, then there would be a white square, a block of square. So let's take a look at an online photo editor, and once again there are alternatives to this one as well. And I have now loaded both of these magnifiers in here, once with an opaque background, a transparent background, and one where there has not been the background, where that background has not been yet removed. And if that wasn't the case, then exactly this white square would be visible on our website. In this case where I'm using that magnifier on, that background is already white, so it wouldn't make any difference at that given moment. But of course also ultimately what we want control of the background. For example, now I'm giving that magnifier a background of yellow. And of course now that background will be yellow. But it's only visible because that magnifier has has opacity, is transparent around in those areas. Otherwise that yellow background would be behind that yellow square that's now on front. So ultimately that is the core feature that PNG has. For icons we need opacity for icons to be used, at least for icons that are not of square type or rectangle, such as a circle for example. And let me now go over how to remove that background, because it's just such a common thing that we are doing, so we already know how to do it. And first of all, what we need here is to unlock the layer, the background layer, by double clicking on this lock, and then we can make use of that wand tool. And then once we select the area, then a certain selection will be made based on the tolerance. If I go for 21, it's a number in between 0 and 200 and 255. So once again, it's 256 options and it's 256 shades of colors. And meaning once I click on white, let me go down to 21. Once I click on the white area, now it takes 21 shades to the darker and 21 shades to the lighter direction of white. Now white is already the lightest, therefore it won't be any lighter, but in this case it will go 21 shades into the darker. It will also select 21 shades in the darker direction. And once I select now, click on that white area, it also selects part of my magnifier, which of course I don't want, because all I want to remove at that given point is that white background and nothing else. So the selection is ultimately determined by that tolerance here, and now by now setting it to 15, that is only 15 shades, which is absolutely fine right now to be used. It will only select the white areas without affecting the actual magnifier. And once I now hit, for example, the delete key on my keyboard, then that white background gets removed ultimately. And this is how we can make things opaque. What we need to pay attention to, however, as well, is once we save now that magnifier, then we cannot save it as JPEG format. Because JPEG format has that core feature, it can be changed in quality and therefore tremendously reducing the file size, which we can also do right here in that example online photo editor. But for PNG, the core advantage is that it is opaque, and JPEG doesn't allow opacity. So here we can see it on our magnifier. Now once again it has this white background, and if we save it as JPEG, then ultimately our work here that we have just done of removing of making that background opaque was completely in vain. So ultimately we need to go for PNG, and here we can see now that background, it's now transparent. So this is what we need for icons. We don't need to have pixels kicked out. We don't need them to be kicked out. Instead, what we rather need is opacity. And often we use icons on our website, and whenever we make use of too many icons ultimately, then we should go for a sprite. Because whenever we have many icons, of course, each image element ultimately results in a server request. So now it's going to the server, the browser passes on, and then again it encounters an image element, and again it will go to the server, and again it will go, and again. So many server requests, ultimately causing our server first of all to be busy, and when too many people are visiting our websites, then there are many server requests ultimately. And maybe sometimes we reach a point where our server is not that fast in handling all these server requests, ultimately causing congestion, and therefore the websites for the end user that are right now in that congestion, their website will not load as fast as it could. So in that situation, whenever we make use of too many icons, we ultimately should go for a sprite. And that is the case, for example, when we have text editing options on our website with all these icons, text editing icons, or for example when we make use of a lot of language flags, when we have multiple languages, multiple language support on our website, or for example when we make use of quite a number of social icons, or for example we have a sports website and each team has its own logo, its own icon ultimately. So these are a couple of examples when we ultimately should go for a sprite. Now let us create one of those sprites. And once again, there are websites out there. This is just an example website right here. And on this example website, we can, first of all, we browse for our icons that we want to be included inside our sprite. Here we can always, if we need more, we can select more options here. And here are other options, how much space we ultimately want in between the icons. And also, for example, whether we want the background to be transparent. Now, in this case, we absolutely need transparency because once again, these icons are not of square shape. They are of rounded shape, meaning ultimately here would be a white background then. And this we don't want, of course. In this case, here a white background, a transparent background is completely not necessary. All of them are of square shape, all these icons, and having a gap in between them also doesn't really matter. So these are the options that we have, and once we hit on generate, then it will be generating our sprite ultimately. So I have already done this, and because also this takes a little time, and here that is that sprite I have generated. It's exactly the icons that we are currently using on our example website here, the magnifier, the English flag and the Russian flag ultimately. And now let us make use of this sprite to now get each individual icon inside that sprite being displayed now in the same way as we have done it right now. And we cannot do this with content images. Because once we go, for example, let me replace the Russian flag now with the sprites.png. It will now display all the images, the entire image of course. And we have no control with content images over what shall be displayed inside that image. Only, for example, a certain area, such as only the area where the magnifier is. So what we need to go for in this situation, we need to go for background images. There is no way that we can achieve this ultimately with content images, and therefore I will now outcomment those content images right here. Instead, what I will be using are background images and backgrounds that are set for these div elements that I have already created right here. And right now these div elements are empty. And once we set a background inside an element, it's still empty. It doesn't belong to the content. It's in the background. And these div elements are by default, these are container elements, and container elements are always display block. Therefore we need to set them to display inline block in order for them to, of course, to be next to each other. And what is the rule again when we have inline level container boxes? What is the width and the height if we don't specify anything? Then the width will be as wide as the content and the height will be as high as the content. However, there is no content right here, and once we set a background, there still won't be any content. So first of all, what I will be doing now, I will be giving that magnifier container box first of all a width and a height. And that width and that height that I want is exactly the width and the height of the sprite, of the magnifier that is inside that sprite. And I have created that magnifier in 25 pixels width and 25 pixels height. And that is exactly what I will be using now. 25 pixel width, and also I will go for the height in 25 pixels. Now, this box is already there. Right now it has a background of yellow, and instead of using now that background color yellow, let me replace it by an actual image. And how do we do it? We first of all need to call the URL function, because that one has that functionality. It can fetch us an image from the server. And all we need to give him, of course, is the path. And because a path only consists of text, or the only option at least that we have in here is just a text option, path is just text, therefore we need to wrap it inside quotation marks. So once again, now I will be going out one folder because I'm inside CSS. So going out one folder, then into the images folder, and then I will be including the sprite.png. Going out one folder, then into the images folder, and now I will be including sprite.png. And now let's take a look what actually what that resulted in. And here we can all we can see is now a little gap on top, and then this English flag for now. Because right now we have a little gap on top, and then it's displaying now 25 pixels in width and in height of that area right here, which includes that little gap and then maybe 3/4 of that English flag right now. So now we need to define ultimately the position. Where do we want those 25 pixels in width and in height to be displayed? And the position is the third value in the shortcut after repeat. Therefore, let me go for the position. And the position is made up of two values. First of all, horizontal, and then second value is vertical. And the horizontal value we can pretty easily infer by that image, because it's right at the edge here. So meaning the horizontal is 0. So don't go any further than inside here. It's all 0 right here. So horizontal is 0. Now the vertical, how do we find out that vertical value now? And that one, of course, we could measure now that area here until it reaches the magnifier, but there are easier options, and options that we also rely upon when we make use, for example, of a sprite that we have not created ourselves. Because then, first of all, we don't know the width and the height of that certain icon. We could measure it, but there are easier options. So once again, there is a website, and once again, there are alternative websites out there as well. So here we can upload ultimately our sprite that we have created, and then we can select the certain area, that certain icon, and it will give us the information first of all in width and height, the dimensions, and also ultimately the position at which that icon will be displayed if we use that position. And it's -74 pixels, because ultimately we are pushing upwards, making the Russian and the English flag to ultimately overflow on top. So we need to move that image towards the top, ultimately making it a negative number here, which is -74. And that number I will now be inserting here, and that will ultimately result now in the magnifier being there at the same location as it was before, while the Russian flag and the English flag are further up here, and the overflowing content for background images will never be visible. So it doesn't matter. Things are overflowing now on top, and only the magnifier is shown. Let me also now do the exact same thing for the other two icons as well. So I'm now selecting one flag here. Both of these flags have a width and a height of 3225, and that one is at position -41, or will be displayed at the position -41, and the other one, the English flag, is at position -4. So exactly those I will now be inserting, and I will just copy and paste this one over here. So that's the English flag, that one will be at -4, and the Russian flag will be at -41. And now, once again, we actually now have the exact same result as we had before. The difference is that we are now using background images and a sprite, meaning we only have one single server request to retrieve one single image, and then we ultimately select the icons inside that image based on the position and the dimensions that they have. One shortcoming that these icons or these sprites have is that we lose complete flexibility in terms of dimensions ultimately. For example, if I wanted to decide, I ultimately decide that this search input field has a height that is too high. I want it to be smaller, for example. So now let me reduce it from 25 pixel to 20 pixel, and that of course will result that the magnifier doesn't fit in there anymore. And I cannot change now the size of that magnifier, because it will always have ultimately its original size that it has inside the sprite. We cannot change that anymore, so we lost flexibility here, and that is quite a disadvantage that these sprites ultimately have. And therefore we take a look at an alternative options that we have. We can draw our icons ourselves. which we go over in a moment. But this is now all we need to know in order to ultimately decide which option to go for. Shall we go for a content image or for a background image in situations where really both of them can be used? And let us now face both of these, face them off, these two options. Content images, first of all, are part of the content. And whenever something is part of our content, part of our HTML, things are in the flow. Meaning wherever the code is, this is ultimately where that code will be displayed, where that content will be displayed on our website. So meaning, for example, if I insert something before the image now, then this one will be inserted before the image, and the image will then be displayed afterwards. If I insert something after the image, it will be displayed after the image. Things are in the flow. And how do we get something on top of the image? We can in fact do. And we will take a look at that in 2 weeks ahead of us. However, it involves additional code to be written. So that is one consideration. With background images, the content straight away is on top, because the background, as the name implies, of course, the image is not part of the content, it's in the background. It's not affecting the content. It's not part of the flow of our content. So content is straight away on top of that image. In this case, here we need extra code to write. So that is content images, extra code, background images are already in the background, and content will be on top straight away. Next trade-off is accessibility. And for content images, what we can use here is the alternative attribute. And the alternative attribute ultimately describes the image. Therefore, screen readers that are used by sight-disabled people and also search engine robots can ultimately make more sense of that website, what this website is about at that given location, and then also in total what this website is about. So this alt attribute can also be used ultimately for us to push us in the search engine rankings. And also for sight-disabled people, so at least they have an idea of what that image is about. And therefore, it's accessibility here as well. Now, in very few situations, we sometimes come across that we can use an alternative solution here, which is the title attribute. So for example, the title attribute is a global attribute, and let me give now that div element here, that title attribute, because it cannot have the alternative attribute. That is a specific attribute that only the image element can have. And therefore, let me give it now the title attribute. And now whatever I write in here, so once again I go for Disney Castle, can also be used by screen readers and by search engine robots in order to identify what this is about. But however, this one will now be displayed in a so-called tooltip. And it will always be visible once we go over that area. And now let's assume that this is only the background here, that castle. However, there might be content on top of it that has nothing to do with the castle, maybe just with Disney, but not necessarily with the castle. So it doesn't make sense to use that title now here, Disney Castle. So it's sometimes in very few situations it can really make sense, but usually it doesn't. So the alternative attribute is certainly a great advantage that the content images have in comparison to what we can do with the background images. So there is another trade-off. And now comes print. So content images will always be printed once we click the print button. However, in comparison to background images, they won't be printed. So here's the trade-off depending on our situation. Whether we want things to be printed or not, whether that is even a consideration, completely depends on the website that we are building. Next one is cross-browser support. And that one we have already touched on last week, that the object fit property is not supported by Microsoft, neither by the Internet Explorer nor by the Edge browser. And therefore, we could use the background size property to cover or contain an image. And that one is supported by Microsoft. So here is another trade-off. And let me once again go over that actual code, just in case we make use of it. I have gone over a list last week where we can always find those so-called polyfills. which are the remedy solutions for browsers that do not support a certain, for example, HTML element or a certain CSS property. And there we can choose from other options. But just in case, we should use that option. So let me go over that code, because I kind of ran over it last week and didn't completely explain it. So what is actually happening here? It's detecting, first of all, whether the object fit property is supported. And if it's not supported, then I'm selecting now my elements, in this case only my photo element, which I can also select further elements by dividing them up by comma. Now comes the next one, or a class, selecting by class. And my element, however, on which I have used the object fit property on, is exactly that content image that I have given an ID of photo. And what I am doing now is I am removing the source attribute and I am removing the alternative attribute. Instead, what I am doing is I am adding a class. So let me just go down into that code once again. So I'm removing the source, the alternative attribute, and I'm adding a class with the name IEBG. And that class I have already given its appearance here, that element with that class. So that one ultimately will receive, instead of a content image, it will receive a background image. A background image by which I can then make use of background size and cover, which I cannot do with object fit cover when a browser does not support the object fit property. So that is actually what is happening here. So that one is another trade-off that we must consider when we decide whether to use a content or a background image in a trade-off situation. And now the last one that we have discussed was sprites. So once we make use of quite a number of icons on our website, we ultimately should go for a so-called sprite. Because with content images, we cannot select only part of an image at a certain location. We are reliant upon background images at this point here. Now, one more comment that I want to do is, last week also kind of I ran over, is two tools that I wanted to mention in regards to the colors. So RGB and the hex code we have introduced last week. And this is once again just an example website. There are alternatives out there. And here we can find out all the information about a certain color. So either we can select a range of colors right here, or we can search for a certain color on top here. And once we have selected that color, we get the information, for example, all the shades into the darker direction, into the lighter direction, what are the fitting colors that go with that color. So ultimately helping us, such a website, to decide which colors to use, which colors that fit to our color that we use on our website. Another tool is the color picker. And that one is a Firefox extension. Maybe it exists in other browsers as well. I haven't checked that one. So color picker is, once we go over with our mouse here on any website, it will always tell us what that certain color at that given point is. And it will tell us that in the hex code as well as in the RGB code. And whatever we have selected here, once we then hit escape, that color is copied over, and then we can paste it somewhere, usually inside the CSS file. So these are two tools that I briefly also wanted to mention now. And now we are going into alternatives for a PNG format. Because the PNG format is made up of pixels. So is the JPEG format. All these images are made up of pixels. And now let me zoom in. And of course, as we know, the quality of these images ultimately then deteriorates, because we can pretty much see the pixels, that these images are made up of pixels. And that is something that is not that good, or something that can be better. Because instead of making images with pixels, we can also make images with so-called vector areas. Meaning entire areas receive a color. It's not made up of pixels. Ultimately not making not going any worse, not losing any quality, any clarity of the images once they get larger. And that format is the SVG format. And with that SVG format, we can not only include images into the background in that format SVG, or for example, as content images as well. Instead, we can also draw these images by using XML code and by using the SVG, the HTML element SVG. So let me just uncomment this one, because I have already created a quick drawing here of a certain flag, of the Belgium flag in this case. And the SVG element is nevertheless an HTML element. So once the browser starts reading, it encounters this element and then it knows, oh, now whatever comes in here is XML code. And that one I cannot parse, so I give it to the XML parser, so that it outsources that one ultimately. But the SVG code it can still read. That's an HTML element. That's why I'm going over that today, and also because it's a different format, SVG, that is quite a nice one. And the SVG element, so I have created now another icon here. And let me now zoom in here, so we can see that this area, that this image now is not made up of pixels. Instead it's made up of vector, entire areas, meaning they never deteriorate, they never lose quality, clarity once we zoom in. So this is the advantage that we have here. In addition, we don't even have one single server request, because that image, that is code inside our HTML file, meaning we do not contact the server again in order to retrieve a file. Instead we have drawn it right in here. And we have quite a large range of options that we have in terms of drawing. This is the entire vocabulary right here. Of course, now these can also have animations, for example, but of course we are learning HTML, but that is something to keep in the back of our head for later, that we can actually also draw our images, and for the advantage that we don't even have a single server request, and also these images ultimately, they do not lose any quality once they get greater. And this is XML code, XML, the XML language ultimately. This is a website that has a couple of drawing examples. So of course we don't necessarily need to draw the images inside the HTML code. Instead, what we can also do, we can use a drawing software and then save our drawings as SVG files. Now those ones, however, they are still files then. So meaning there is still then ultimately a request to the server for retrieving that SVG file in that case. But nevertheless, SVG files can also be used for background or for content images instead. So it's not restricted to just for us to draw these things. We can also use images that are already out there, available to us in SVG format, and then we can make use of them. And they have then this great advantage that they never lose clarity. Now another one is the canvas I briefly want to mention, and the canvas is also just a container box. So the SVG element is a container box for drawings done in XML. The canvas is a container box for drawings done in a scripting language, usually JavaScript. And container boxes are always display block by default. So that one SVG I have just set to display inline block, making my flag now being next to the other ones in the same line. So but by default they are both block level elements. They are container boxes, that's why. And that one is a container box for drawings as well. Drawings done in JavaScript, and there are really nice things that can be done. So that one once again is an HTML element. But once it encounters this element, it knows, inside here, that one I cannot read, so it outsources. The HTML parser won't read whatever is inside here, of course. And this is an example website here, so we can let the snow fall, for example. That's snow animations on top of an image. Or, for example, we have water can made to run here, as we can see. And quite nice things can be done with a canvas ultimately, because the canvas also provides its own viewport ultimately with its coordinates. And many animations can be done on top then, and shapes can be created. So it's quite a nice thing to have. And also games are done with that element ultimately. So also something to keep in our back of our head. Of course we are not into JavaScript yet, at least not from this course. So that is something to consider, because that's also nevertheless an HTML element. So is the SVG. Just whatever is inside then is not HTML. So HTML parser will always outsource it. Two more elements I briefly want to mention, and that is the figure and the figcaption element, which are used whenever we are illustrating something, have a diagram, something like this, a graph. For example, these are images, of course, which are not actual diagrams or illustrations, but because I was illustrating something to you, that's why that makes them to be illustrations. They are not really part of that website, just for illustration purposes. They actually exist. And whenever that is the case, whenever we have a graph or an illustration, something like this, related to this, then we should make use of the figure element, which is a meaningful element telling screen readers and search engine robots ultimately, hey, this is an actual figure that is right there. So that's the figure element, and once again, that's a container box, meaning it will be display block by default. And let me just place now that figure, that illustration of that background image in this case, inside here, and let us take a look. So by default it's display block. I haven't yet set it to inline block, so meaning it's taking up in its own line completely, causing whatever is coming afterwards or before cannot be in the same line. And also in here it's the figcaption, which is a child of figure, can only be a child of figure ultimately, because it's the title, the caption, the title of that figure, and whatever we write in here will ultimately be centered, by default at least, underneath that image. So these are two additional elements I briefly wanted to mention that are kind of related to drawings, diagrams, illustrations, all these kind of things. But this is it. Now we are going into the format summary. So we are dealing with JPEG, PNG, SVG, and also GIF. And GIF, they have the advantage that they do support animation first of all, and they also do support opacity, transparency in the background. The negative part of GIF is that we can only make use of 256 colors, nothing else. So while with all the other formats, we ultimately have 256 colors for red, for green, and for blue, which ultimately gives us something like 17,000 options instead of just 256. So we are dealing in JPEG and PNG and SVG with 24 bits, with 3 bytes. 1 byte for each color, red, green, and blue. While in GIF, we are only having 1 byte, 8 bits available for for choosing a color from. Now JPEG, PNG, and GIF, they are raster, bitmap images. And all that means they are made up of pixels. So that is the jargon word for it. While SVG are made up of vector areas. Now the compression is for JPEG, we can kick out pixels. So we can lose pixels. It's considered to be a lossy format. In comparison to all the other ones, they are lossless. We never lose something. They can nevertheless be compressed in the way I briefly mentioned before. So such as it's easier to say, hey, white, 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 white. It's easier to say 32 times white. So they can still be compressed, but ultimately they will be recreated in their original form with all their pixels. So we are never losing pixels ultimately here. So it's lossless. That's a lossless format, a lossless compression they have. Then opacity, JPEG doesn't allow this alpha value. That's RGBA, alpha value standing for opacity. And JPEG doesn't support it, while all the other ones support it. And animations are not supported by JPEG nor by PNG, while GIF and SVG support animations. So this is a summary, so we can always decide which formats we need to go for ultimately, what is the best option at the given situation. And now come gradients. And gradients are now these merging colors that we can give colors to the browser, and the browser will create an image for us based on those colors, and it will make it great, will make those colors great, merge into each other. And whenever we make the browser to do something, then we are calling a function. So that is exactly what we are doing now. And it's either the linear gradient function or the radial gradient. Linear meaning a line shape like this one. Radial meaning it's a rounded shape. And these are the two functions that we can make use of, and also two additional ones that we will take a look at in a moment. So once again, we will be using the background property here. But instead of using it now as a shortcut for all these values from these properties here, instead we will be adding a function in here, nothing else. We won't make use of those properties that can also be used as part of the background property right here. So all we are doing is we are calling a function, and therefore I have created those two container boxes right here. So by default I have made them, I have let them by their default value display block, meaning they take up the entire line. And then in order for me to center them, for us to center them, I made them margin left 0 auto and margin right auto, by which we can always center block level elements, while inline level elements we center with text align center. And these gradients I will now be doing, as well as also background images, can not only be done on container boxes, but also, for example, on a button element, text area, and a couple of other elements. So we are not constrained here to just container boxes. So let us go now for that gradient, and I have given both of them, I have given an individual class name. First of all, the one I called linear, the other one I called radial. And that is exactly where I will now, the elements that I will now be targeting, the elements with that class name. And first I will go with linear, meaning a line shape of gradient that we ultimately want. So I'm calling now the background property, and instead of using now it as a shortcut for all these other values, I will now be calling the linear gradient function. So once again, it's just a block of code inside the browser, and that can do a certain functionality for us. And the functionality it can ultimately provide us an image based on the colors that we specify. Now the colors that we specify can be in English Word, and that is just text, nothing else. And whenever there is text, we actually supply quotation marks, but it's not just text that we can supply here. For example, we can also use the RGB, once again a function, another function in here, or the hex code that we have introduced last week, or RGBA is also possible. Let me now go, however, for the English keywords only. And the colors that I will be using now is red, green, and ultimately also blue. So exactly the three base colors, and that's it already. Here we have our gradient. The browser has now created us an image based on the colors that we have given him. And it will organize these colors in a way that they always go, the first color starts at top, and they march towards bottom, to bottom. And that is exactly the default value that is being used if we don't specify anything. And that is the value, the direction, the value that is at position 1 here. It's to bottom that's being used. And now we can change it, of course, to top, which of course changes it. It's going now marching to top. The first color is going to top the gradient ultimately, and which would be the same if we just reversed these colors here. Other options that we have is to left and to right. So now getting that gradient to be horizontal instead. And we also have full control by specifying a value now in degrees. So it's another unit that we are introducing now. And degrees, any degrees, let me know, and we only use that abbreviation here, DEG ultimately. Now let me reload it, and we can see it a little bit that the red gradient is actually not completely straight here. So there 0 degrees is actually not right here in the middle, instead it's further on that side. And then 90 degrees is approximately here, then 180 is right here, approximately 270, and ultimately at the same position at 0, of course, there is also 360 then right here. So if we go, for example, for a diagonal direction, so for approximately for the first corner, it's 35 degrees. So it's going in clockwise, same direction. And here approximately we have it. So ultimately we have full control over the direction, complete control over, by specifying things in degrees. And we also have full control over the color stops. When shall a color reach its full strength? For example, green right now reaches its full full strength at 50% of that container box, while the background color, while the blue color reaches its full strength, its full blue. It's when it's not grading anymore. It's full blue it achieves right at that point at the edge, at the very end. And at the very beginning, that's the only point where right now the red is at its full strength. And from that point onward, it will start grading. And everybody gets an equal share if we don't specify anything else. So the red gets 1/3, the green and the blue ultimately as well. And now we have full control over that as well. By specifying a value in percent or in pixels, attaching it after the color. And that one will always tell the browser when we want the color to stop. When shall the color be at 100% strength, at full strength? So for example, I will now go for red 50 pixels, meaning ultimately the red color will be already at full strength at the beginning, but also at 50 pixels. And then from that point onwards, it will start to grade. And that we can also specify in percent. For example, let me now use 30% for green, meaning somewhere here. Now green will reach its full potential, its full color, 100%, right here. At 30% in relation to the box, of course, in which that gradient is applied on. Now blue, let me set that one to 50%, meaning it will reach its full potential right here in the center, and ultimately from that point onwards it will not grade anymore. It will remain at its full color, at its full strength until the end of the box. And that is a sign that we can make things repeat once we are not making up, taking the entire 100% of that box with a gradient. We can also let a gradient repeat, and that is another function that we can call repeating linear gradient. So now right now that gradient is repeated from that point onwards. All that is not part of the gradient. This is not a gradient, this is just full color. So from that point onwards it will repeat. Same here, it will repeat right here. So this is the actual result now. So once I remove now the 50 pixels from the red, it will be exactly twice. Our shape here, exactly it will exist twice inside the background. 50% is half, so here it's half, once one gradient until the middle, and then once again the next gradient taking up the remaining space. And this is how we can make things repeat. Let me now make it a little bit nicer here. Let me go for red, white and red. So ultimately we really have full control of the colors and also of the direction, and also whether we want things to be repeated over and over again. So that is the options that we have. Now let's go for radial gradients. And background, the next one is a rounded shapes, radial gradient. And that one, once again, all we need to give him at least, of course, are 2 colors. Otherwise it would just be a background color, nothing else. And the colors that I will be giving him now is, once again, just let me start with red, green and blue. And that is how things look like now. This is a radial shape, radial gradient. And by default, that rounded shape has a shape of a so-called ellipse. And that is exactly that keyword that's being used. That is the first value in this, in here. It's the shape. And the value that's being used, if we don't specify anything, is ellipse. And the other one that we can use is circle, meaning a complete circle shape. That is the rounded shape that we want, the radial shape of a circle. And we can ultimately define where that circle shall be at any location in here. So we also have full control over that. And it always is in regards how far from the left and how far from the top that circle shall be. Now, which part of the circle is the question, of course. Which part of the circle shall be away from the left and away from the top? And it's always the very center, where the gradient starts, where the first color begins, the center in this case, completely the center. And we specify this by using the at first of all. We want that circle to be at position from the left. We can specify once again things in pixel or in percent. It's completely up to us. And then it will be 50 a pixel away from the left, the center of the circle, and 80% down now from the top. So right here it is. And whenever we make use of the circle shape now, we can also make use of an additional keyword here, but only when we make use of circle or ellipse. otherwise we can't. So there is another option that we have as well, which we go over in a moment. But here we can now decide ultimately where the ending shape of that circle shall reach towards. And here we can use closest corner, farthest corner, furthest, closest side and farthest side. So let me go for closest corner. And the closest corner from the center of this shape here is this one, of course. That's the closest corner to it. And here we can see, so this is where it is reaching towards now. And this is all the shape that we have right now. Now the other one is closest side, which is not too much difference. It's now this side here. So it's a little bit closer to than the corner is to the center. And therefore the shape has reduced a little bit here. And the other two values are farthest. Farthest side, so the farthest side in this case is this one. And here it's reaching towards now. The ending shape is going towards that direction. So this is where we have that control over. However, that one we can only use once we make use of circle or ellipse, meaning the English keywords here. We can always also use we can also create our own shape in any form that we want, any radial shape that we want to have. All we need to determine, of course, is the width and the height that we want that shape to have. So for example, once again, either in percent or in pixel, let me go for 200 pixel in width, and now comes the height. So we always start with horizontal and then it's vertical. All the time, that's the case. Also here, starting from left, which is horizontal, and then top is vertical. Always horizontal, then vertical. So 200 pixel width, and the height, I want that one to be 80 pixel in regards to the box, of course. And here we go. Now this is the shape that ultimately resulted out of that settings that I have given. So it's still kind of a circle. A little bit flatter. Not really an ellipse, but not really a circle at this given point. And now comes repeating, our last one. Repeating radial gradient. Once again, in the same way, we can also repeat now. However, here we set things to 50% because it was necessary in order for that gradient to even repeat in the first place. If that 50% weren't there, then it couldn't repeat because already it takes up the entire area. So the 50%, it must be below 100. However, in that situation right here, it's not really necessary because I have changed the shape to 280%. So already making that circle smaller. Here we can see the end result already making the circle smaller, only going until here. The width 200, meaning there is an additional 200 pixel width and an additional. So right now it's repeating pretty much 3 times, a little bit more than 3 times. So once again, we also have control over the repetitions here, meaning we ultimately have really complete control. We just need to give that settings, all we need to the browser, and it will ultimately create us that shape, that image with those gradients. So that once again is from the left, width of the shape from the left. That's the height, that's the width of the shape, that's the height, and then comes the position. Add from the left, from the top, and then the colors. And here, of course, we can also use add pixel or percent afterwards. And we are also, let me actually go for blue. We are not constrained to just use a gradient. So we can also mix background images with gradients together. So background images we have discussed last week, and whenever we are using multiple backgrounds, then we are dividing things up by comma, and the first one will always be in the foreground. And how do we do a background image? We of course set the URL function to first of all include our image, which is that function that can fetch an image or any file from the server. And this is just text that we can insert here, so therefore we use quotation marks. And once again, I'm going out one folder into the images folder, and the image that I will now be including is the pencils_medium.png, an image that we may have seen already when I had that tab open with the online photo editor here. It's right that image, those pencils. And in the background, it's complete transparent, while exactly it's surrounded by all these pencils. So that one, I will not be using, because that one is for border images. Sorry, I just got confused. Instead, what I will be using is now that stone figure here. And that stone figure has also, nevertheless, also has a transparent background. And that one I now want to have be contained inside that box. So I don't want to be cover the entire area, just instead I want to be inside. So nothing shall overflow. So it's quite a large image, and it has transparency. So first of all, what I want, the second part of that shortcut here, is no repeat. And now comes the position, which I want center. I want that figure, that image to be in the center of that box. Now one setting now that is not part of the shortcut is background size, by which we can determine now how much of that image shall take up, how much of that image shall fill the area. So not cover, instead I want that one to be contained inside. It shall have its original size, and it shall never overflow. It shall never lose its ratio, and it shall never overflow. And now I have actually used the pencils. So the one that I actually wanted to use, sorry, is that stone figure. Stone figure. Right there. And here we go. So we are not constrained here. We can use as many images together, also with a gradient. We are completely free here. To the number of how many images we use. Of course, the gradient is in the background, and the gradient can only be used, there can only be one gradient ultimately, of course. Now, let's go into our last topic. And before we do so, actually one more comment, and that is, can I use, because their Opera Mini is not supporting gradients, and there is just a quick remedy solution. So in addition to specifying the gradient, what we then do, previous to that code, we specify another background of a similar color that we actually have that gradient in. So in this case it's red. And now when a person is visiting our website and that person is using an Opera browser, a mobile Opera Mini browser, Opera is supporting it. It's just the Opera Mini, the one for mobile phones. And whenever a person is using that one, then his browser cannot display any gradients. So what it will display instead, it will display background, in this case red, which I have chosen. And then this one it cannot read, so it will just skip it. And for all the other browsers, this one will be skipped, because those ones are coming later, and those browsers can read those gradient functions. And therefore, those ones will be applied. And this one will be applied ultimately now. This one will be skipped as well, because this one is overwriting this one is overwriting this one. So that is the ultimate image that will be taken. Now let's go into the last topic of today, and that is border images, meaning images that are inside the border area that we have defined on a certain element. And therefore, once again, I have created already two other additional boxes right here, which I have now formatted. And as soon as we have formatted our website, we cannot make use of the uncomment option anymore, at least not that I know of. And these two boxes I have placed empty, nothing inside. So all we want here is now a border, and inside that border there shall be an image. And also in here we can place gradients, so we are not just limited to images. And this is what I will be doing on the second box. The first box I will be using to place an actual image, or an image by ourselves inside, not a gradient image. So both of them I have given an individual class value of one border gradient, the other one border frame. And that border frame, actually, let me place that one on top, and that one I will now be targeting. Border, or actually it's right there, border gradient and border frame. So what we need first of all is a border, and that border I will be setting to 35 pixel. The style I will be giving it is a solid style, so the regular one, and the color I will just use blue, which becomes irrelevant in a second, because the border image will ultimately replace that color. Now come the actual settings. So it's border image, and that is a shortcut. So once again, let us go over the individual properties first that are part of this shortcut. And therefore, in order to define the source, first of all, we need, of course, the URL function again in order to fetch now the image that we want to be included. But instead of using, like in background image, we are now using background image source, because background image, that property name is already taken by the shortcut. And here, once again, we are calling the earl function, and in here we specify the path to the file that we want to have included. So once again, I will be going out one folder into the images folder, and now comes that file that I already used, which is pencils.medium, and that's exactly the one that we have already taken now a look at, pencils medium. And as soon as we have specified the source, once that has been done, then the browser will take our element and will divide it up into 8 different areas, into 4 corners, 1, 2, 3, 4, into 4 sides, number 5, 6, 7, and 8, and the actual content area, which is box number 9. And let me reload the page now, and here we can see already these areas, how our element has now been divided into. And by default, what it's being done is that image with those pencils is now being displayed in each corners at its full size, at 100% in its full, not in its full dimensions, but in its full, how much it can take up here in its full without anything gone. And that is exactly what the next property is in charge of. So the next one is border image slice. And with that property, we are ultimately now determining how now our image shall be sliced into how many parts. So ultimately, we can now also slice our image into 9 different areas, meaning our element is already now sliced into 9 areas. And now by defining ultimately how our image will be sliced, we decide how much of each part of that image will be in each part of the element in each boxes, in the corner boxes and in the side boxes, as well in the content as well as in the content area. Now we will at the beginning we will concentrate completely on the corner boxes. So by default, what is happening now, why that image is displayed in the corner boxes, is because the default value that is being used is for each slicing line. The value is right now 100%, and there is a slicing line for the top, for the right, for the bottom, and for the left. And meaning we are using these values in the exact same way as we use padding and margin when we use those values for all sides differently. Meaning we can use also these values with only 3, with only 2, and only 1 value, or this property we can make use of. Same as with padding and with border, exactly in the same way. Let me now make use of all 4 of them, even though in this case 1 would absolutely be enough, because all sides, top, right, bottom, and left, are exactly the same. And what does 100% stand for now? So let's investigate this one. It stands for the slicing lines, for 4 slicing lines. So the top slicing lines is actually at 0% right here. However, by default it is set to 100%, meaning it is not on top here. Instead, it's right at the bottom, where the image ends. Now comes the right slicing line. And once again, that one is not right here. Instead, it's at 100% by default, so going over all the way to the other end of the image. Now comes the bottom, same thing here, it's not at the bottom. Instead, right now it's at 100% of the image, meaning at the end of the image on top, and left as well. And that ultimately results in the entire image being displayed in the 4 corner areas, as it happens to be, as we have seen right here. Now let's change the top value to 50%, while the other ones we let remain at 100%. And now let us investigate that in using that diagram first before we actually see the result. So top doesn't take the entire image anymore. Instead, it only goes to 50%. So this slicing line is now cutting that image in half, basically. Now, while right is still at 100%, bottom is still at 100%, and left is also still at 100%. But what has happened now to the both corner boxes on top? Meaning not the entire image is being displayed in there anymore, but only half of that image. So only going until the red pencils here and here, until pretty much the pink pencils right on here. So let's take a look at the actual result, and now something will happen. Therefore, something will happen here, which is not the case, because I have I saved it? Yes, I have saved it. 50, 100, 100. Border image. something is wrong here. Image slice. Here we go. And now what's being displayed only is until red, as we can see. And here only until basically pink. But Firefox does something that doesn't make any sense. To me at least not. So let me go for the Chrome browser therefore, or for any other browser, because they are sticking to the rule actually here. And once I reload here we can actually see what happens. Because we are only concentrating on the corner areas right now. And here it goes until red pencil, and here we can see slightly the red pencil coming out here. So that is exactly where we have placed the slicing line. Right, only that area is now being displayed in the two top corner boxes. Now Firefox still ultimately comes to the same end result, but I don't get the logic behind here. Therefore let me use any other browser but Firefox in order to explain this now, bring this across. So let's continue now with bottom, 75%. So in addition to top being 50, this is right, now comes bottom, and that one I'm now changing to 75%. So what will happen? Top will only be at 50%, that's where the slicing line has been positioned. Right will still be at 100. Bottom will only go now until 75%, only until here. And left will go to 100. So it's now exactly the same effect, just for the bottom corner boxes. They will not take the entire image now anymore to be displayed in these corner boxes at the bottom, instead only this part. So the right one goes until orange here, the left one basically until black. So let's take a look at the result, and here we can see it goes until orange and until black. And that part is now being displayed right in here. Now comes the next one. Now we are also taking the right value into account. So let me take now the 100% here and change it to 80%. And what happens now? Top once again goes to 50%. Now comes the right one, only going to 80. Bottom goes to 75. Left goes to 100. And now let's take a look at the areas that are affected by right, which are top right and bottom right. Meaning bottom red and gray, bottom right will now have this area. Oops, that's the wrong drawing tool. It will now have this area being displayed, the bottom right. And top right will have that area be displayed until blue. Top is blue, right is gray. This is the area on top. So meaning in the bottom, we will only go until green anymore on the left, and on top only until kind of brownish on the left. So let's take a look here. So we will be cutting here now off right here and here as well. And here on top in the black area. So only those ones, sorry, not here. Here we go. So here in the black and here in the green. So we are cutting off. Top right is affected and bottom right by us changing the slicing line for the right. Always the right sides will be affected. By changing things to the top slicing line, always the top ones will be affected. And also same for the other two areas, of course. Now let's also include now left and change left from 100 to 30. And take a look what happens. Top once again goes to 50, right now goes to 80, bottom goes to 75, and left goes to 30. And right now, as we can see, those lines are always overlapping. Let me just bring it out once again. So here goes the blue line to 50, and the red line overlaps it basically. And now the green line comes and overlaps also the right one, the gray line here. So things are right now overlapping. Just something to consider that we will go over in a second. Now we are only concentrating still on the corner. This is the last example for them, for those corners. And here we can see now top gray, top left. What will be in the top left corner, which is defined by blue and by the green slicing line. So that part will now be in the top corner. Now in the right top corner will be defined by gray and by blue. So this part will be in the top right corner. Now bottom left corner will of course be defined by blue and by green in this case. So it will be that part will be in the bottom left corner, while this part in right bottom will be defined by blue and gray will be this area. And here we can see that this area here, it has more of the actual inner part inside it, while this one's less. So let's take a look at the actual effect first. What happened here? Now things are sliced in that way. So what has changed now by us adding the left one is top left, for example. So top left is now only going until right here, until the green one, as we can see. And bottom left has changed for us now in our example. So that one is only going until green as well here now. And here we can see those pencils. They are greater, and here they are pretty tiny. And that is exactly the reason, because on the right side, that one is taking up now right bottom, which is this area. So here it's taking up also this entire area here, giving only the pencils here smaller room inside the border area, because more has to be given to that area as well. While in comparison to the other side here, that one, for example, bottom left, which is this area, only takes up that little amount here of the inner part, giving the pencils more room inside that border area, ultimately making those pencils to be greater ultimately, and those ones to be thinner in this. Not greater, to be wider, and those ones to be thinner ultimately. So now we have discussed the border corners, the corner areas. Now how do we get ultimately now the side boxes, the box number 5, 6, 7 and 8 to also be occupied with those pencils? And that is exactly when we do not let those lines overlap with each other. So once we go, for example, let us go back to top and bottom first. Once we go to top 50, going right here, and now bottom only 40, meaning it's below 100%. So meaning it does not go over the blue, it does not overlap it anymore. And now it's exactly that area in which those are not overlapping. That area will now be used for the left and for the right side of the boxes. So meaning they will be pink here and red here. So the entire area will be used ultimately. So let me change those values now once again back to, actually here it was 50 on top, 100 on the right. Now 40 only, which is less than 100%. Here is 50, vertically less than 100%. And here go back to 100. Ultimately, here what will happen? They will now take up also these areas. With here pink, the pink ones, the 3 pink pencils, and here 2.5 or something like 3 red pencils. Exactly also on that side. And now of course, once we do not let the horizontal slicing lines overlap, exactly the same thing will happen to the top and to the bottom sides as well. So that is now what I will be doing, and I will be setting now this value to I think 75. Let me check. 75, yes, and 20. 75 will be the right and the left will be 20. Now let's take a look. So top goes to 50, bottom right first of all goes to 75, bottom goes to 40, does not overlap the top, the vertical lines do not overlap, and now comes the left and does also now not overlap the right one. It's less than 100%, meaning of course now also this area will now be occupied by this area until here will be occupied by the top side. Because now we have our 9 boxes, exactly our 9 boxes we have now. This is corner top left, this is corner top right, this is corner bottom right, this is corner bottom left, this is the side on top, this is the side on the right, this is the side on the bottom, this is the side on the left, and this is our content area, box number 9, our actual content area. So now we have sliced our image in exactly 9 areas, and our content, our element is already sliced in 9 areas, and this is where now the images will be placed. Top left, top right, etc. So let's take a look how this ultimately looks like. Here we go. This is the actual result. Meaning once again, this is the top side, so only black is here. Now bottom is only green, basically, only those pencils. Then on the left are only the pink ones, on the right are only the blue, the red ones. And once again, because here it needs to also make room for more room to be inside the border area for that opaque part here. Therefore, the pencils here are much thinner than on that side, which here is constrained by that area. It only needs that little bit of that empty space here, and most of it will be assigned to the actual pencils, making those pencils to take up the majority of that border actually that goes until here, 35 pixel we have set that border area to. So that is the logic behind it. And now the question hopefully arises, isn't there a quick option to find out a solution to get our images placed inside this border? And there is, and that one we will be going over now. So all we need to do, we need to know ultimately how wide the top, the border is and how wide. Let me measure that one by using that tool here. So all we need to measure here is now, oops, did it measure it? Here we go. Now that area here, how high that one is, which is something like 100, approximately 100. And now how wide is that area, which is also approximately 100. So we could make use now of two values. Let me only make use of one value, which is 100. And first of all, we need to, we could, if we wanted to provide that in percent, we need to convert it, of course. 100 pixel of the entire width here is how much in percent. But we can also use pixels. So that would be in the equivalent when we use four values now, would be 100, 100, 100, 100. Standing for top, for right, for bottom, and for left. Of course, they are now always the same. All of them are the same. So we can use only one value, which is completely sufficient. And we do not add the px unit afterwards. It's already pixel. It's an error. No result will ultimately be there if we add px afterwards. And here we go. This is the actual end result now. Now, in order to meet one corner and the other one, by default, what is happening is that it's using border image repeat, and the value that is used is stretch. So that is exactly what happens. Therefore, our pencils are now quite wider on the top and on the bottom than they are on the left and on the right, because that area to meet the other corner is wider, of course. Now the other value that we can use is the repeat value, and instead of stretching it, of course, it will now repeat the image, which ultimately results in this one. However, with repeat, whenever it is at the last repetition, maybe the last repetition does not completely fit in here, so therefore it just cuts it off. And here we can see at this pencil here, it's only a half pencil being visible. Same here, only half a pencil, which of course doesn't look good. And here's only a few percent of a pencil. So instead of going for repeat, another alternative that we have is going for round, which value we will encounter once again later on for quite important things. And that value ultimately will not repeat it. Instead, it will take up the entire area by rescaling the images only slightly to ultimately fit them inside, preventing an image to be cut in the middle, in this case from one pencil to be only displayed half or a certain percent of that pencil. So perfectly fitting them in now. So this is our next solution now. Let me actually go back into Firefox here in this case, because everything is fine again. The end result will be the same here as well. And these are the options that we ultimately have. Another option actually to come back to repeat once, to slice once again, is fill. And that is our 9th area. Our 9th area, this is right here. Our content we can now also fill with our background image. However, the area 9 in this case is completely transparent, so therefore there won't be any changes. But there will be changes in the example that we will be doing now in a second with gradients. So this is the fill. Now, before we do so, go into gradients, one more comment on another part of that shortcut, which is border image width. And here we can determine how wide the image shall be. Now the border is 35 pixel, but we can let the image overflow the content area. By default, the value that is used is 1. So for example, if I use 2, then the border image will be twice as wide as the border area, meaning it will be 70 pixel, and the other half, the other 35 pixel, will extend into the content area here. So let me go back to 1 actually, and now the next one is, and the last one is border image outset, which is an offset. That word offset we will encounter next week again, border image outset, and it will ultimately determine how far away shall the border image be from the content. And by default it's 0, so once I use the value 1, it will now be twice away basically, so 35 pixel away. So it will be 35 pixel away where you actually would be. And here we can see, so that is then the actual ultimate end result. Now part of the shortcut are also width and outset. However, in my opinion, I've tried a couple of things. They do not really work once we make use of all the values. So I would recommend to not make them part of the shortcut, instead of only using the source, the slice, and the repeat. So maybe we can find out how to actually get that work with also width and outset. However, I will only be now placing those 3 values in here, and that will be it, while the other ones I keep separate. So now I can outcomment those ones. Now we have only 1 line of code instead of 3, and that nevertheless still leads to the same end result. Let me remove the outset, so this is looks nicer. Now one more comment. Gradient, once we have now understood already the logic behind it, of course that one is skipped. All we are now doing is, let me copy and paste those ones over, is I will be using a border first of all in the same way, and I will be using another image source. Instead I will be using a linear gradient, and I will give it the colors orange, white, and orange. And I will now not go for the shortcut because I want to give you that example once again to individually. So first of all, by default everything is at 100%, even in Firefox. And now let me go for border image slice once again, and let me slice it in the same way as we have done it with the last example right here. So top 50%, right 75, so 50%, 75%, 40 and 20, 40 and 20%, representing clockwise top, right, bottom, and left, 12, 6, 12, 3, 6, 9 o'clock. And now top goes to 50, right goes to 75, bottom goes to 40, 20 goes to, left goes to 20, left goes to 20. Now we have our 9 areas, because these lines do not overlap. Once again, this is corner, top left corner, this is the side on top, this is corner right, etc., etc. But what I now want to indicate is that first of all left, right, and left side and right side will be white, and so will be the content area once we make use of the fill property that we can add at any location here, such as at the end. And now once we do so, now the corners and the sides are still filled in the same way as the logic. The only difference now is we have also made use of now area number 9, which is that tiny area here. That image will now be used, that area number 9 of the image will now be used on the element area number 9, which is the content area. And here everything will be white. So that's the last example that I wanted to make. Now, what is the case here now with gradients? Because here we don't know how wide and how high to make things. Here we could measure, ultimately it's our image, we could measure things to get ultimately the good result. But here we don't know. But we do know actually, so it's 35, we take here the actual border width of 35, because the image we haven't created ourselves, so we don't know, but all we need to do is take now 35, and it will ultimately look, or in this case it will take 1 gradient and fill the entire area in this case, or fill the entire borders in this case. And once we now increase it to twice as much or 3 times as much, it will then also take up different shapes here. So these are border images. We can use gradient images and border images. Next week once again it will be multimedia, so our third part and last part before we continue with positioning our on our website, our content. And next week once again it will also be images a little bit, but only a minor part. 2 more things that we want to discuss are favicons, so-called favicons, which are the icons on top here. Another thing are image maps, which are images with areas on top, and each area can be clicked and we are ultimately ending up at a different location. And also then we are going into videos, audio, embedding external things from other websites such as Google Maps, YouTube videos. So that's up for next week.